When the guards failed to return, and the camp remained silent far longer than any delay should allow, the prisoners began to sense that this absence was not accidental, not temporary, and not a mistake to be corrected, but something deliberate and dangerous, because every moment without orders felt less like freedom and more like the opening move of a trap they could not yet see. As the morning unfolded without interruption, the men became increasingly aware that the silence surrounding them no longer felt like an oversight or a delay waiting to be corrected, but like a condition deliberately allowed to persist, as though the absence of guards had been designed to provoke a reaction that had not yet come. The camp remained exactly as it was, unchanged in shape and structure, yet altered in meaning, because nothing within it responded anymore. They woke as they always had, guided by habit rather than command, and moved through the familiar routines with careful attention, listening not for orders, but for any sign that authority still existed somewhere beyond the edges of the yard. Each sound, no matter how small, drew their focus, and each moment that passed without response deepened the sense that what was happening was being observed from a distance they could not locate. The watchtowers stood empty, but they did not feel abandoned. From the yard, their dark openings appeared watchful in a different way, as if the lack of movement itself were part of the design. No rifles rested against the railings, no figures shifted behind the glass. Yet the towers retained their presence, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground and reminded the men how visible they still were, even when no one stood above them. This visibility mattered. Under captivity, being watched had been a constant, something expected and accounted for. But now the uncertainty of whether anyone might still be observing created a tension that was harder to measure. The men did not know if their actions were unnoticed or silently recorded, and without knowing, restraint felt safer than testing the silence. They gathered in the yard as they always had, spacing themselves instinctively, aligning their bodies with invisible markers learned through repetition, and standing in place long after there was any practical reason to do so. No one suggested leaving the formation, not because it was required, but because leaving felt like stepping into exposure without protection. The open gate remained in view, unchanged and unattended, yet it did not feel like an invitation. It felt like a boundary drawn for another purpose, one that might reveal itself only after a mistake had been made. The men remembered too well how easily apparent freedom could conceal consequence, and the memory of that lesson lingered in every hesitation. Conversation was sparse and cautious. When words were exchanged, they circled around surface observations rather than meaning, avoiding speculation about intent or outcome. To speak openly about the silence would be to acknowledge it, and acknowledging it felt like participation in whatever test might be unfolding. It seemed wiser to behave as though nothing unusual was happening, even as every instinct suggested otherwise. As hours passed without change, the idea that this was all a setup began to settle quietly among them, not as a shared conclusion, but as a shared feeling communicated through posture, glances, and restraint. The men did not need to agree on the details of the trap to agree that one might exist, and that agreement shaped behavior more effectively than any order ever had. By the end of the day, exhaustion set in not from labor, but from vigilance. Every movement required evaluation, every pause invited interpretation, and every choice carried the risk of being the wrong one. The men returned to their barracks as they always had, not because they were instructed to, but because remaining visible in the yard after nightfall felt unwise when the rules were no longer clear. As they lay down to rest, the silence followed them inside, unbroken and unresolved, reinforcing the belief that the absence of guards was not reassurance, but strategy, and that the safest response was patience, even if patience meant waiting indefinitely for a threat that never revealed itself. In this way, the first day without authority did not produce freedom or relief, but suspicion, because the men had learned through experience that the most dangerous moments were not the loud ones, but the quiet ones that invited a mistake. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the silence continued into a second day without interruption, the men began to understand that what they were experiencing was no longer a temporary suspension of order, but a condition that demanded a response, even if that response was to do nothing at all. Time moved forward, yet it offered no markers, no confirmations, and no signals that could be interpreted with certainty, leaving the men to navigate each hour without guidance, while remaining acutely aware that any action might be precisely what the silence was waiting for. Waiting, which had once been imposed by command, now emerged as a strategy. The men delayed decisions not because they lacked the ability to make them, but because delay reduced exposure. Remaining still, remaining predictable, and remaining within familiar routines felt like a way to avoid triggering whatever unseen consequence might still exist. In the absence of visible authority, restraint became a form of caution, and caution felt like intelligence rather than fear. Small movements were calculated carefully. A man who shifted his position did so slowly, as though giving the silence time to respond. Another who adjusted his routine did so incrementally, changing one detail at a time, then pausing to observe whether the camp would react. Each minor deviation became an experiment conducted under the assumption that someone, somewhere, might be watching closely. The open gate continued to occupy their awareness, not as an exit, but as a variable they refused to test. Approaching it would mean committing to an action that could not be undone, and without knowing whether the absence of guards concealed a trap, restraint felt wiser than courage. The men remembered too well how apparent opportunities had been used before to expose defiance, and memory shaped behavior more effectively than any present threat. Conversations reflected this tension. When men spoke, their words were measured and indirect, avoiding conclusions or declarations. Questions about the meaning of the silence were raised only briefly, then allowed to fade without answer, as if speaking them too clearly might transform suspicion into proof. Silence within conversation became as important as silence within the camp, providing a buffer against commitment. As the day wore on, mental fatigue began to replace physical exhaustion. The effort required to remain alert without acting drained energy quietly, leaving the men restless yet cautious, attentive yet uncertain. They moved through familiar spaces repeatedly, tracing patterns that felt safe simply because they were known, allowing repetition to substitute for direction. Gradually, the idea of waiting evolved from necessity into preference. Doing nothing carried fewer risks than doing something, and the longer nothing happened, the more convincing this strategy became. Each hour that passed without consequence reinforced the belief that restraint was being rewarded, even if no one could say by whom. Waiting no longer felt passive, it felt correct. By the infected, they had not escaped the trap. They had stepped into it quietly, believing they were avoiding it. As evening arrived without announcement, the men returned to their barracks once more, not because they were told to, but because night amplified uncertainty, and uncertainty was something they had learned to manage best through withdrawal. Lying awake in the darkness, they listened for sounds that did not come, and in that listening they confirmed what the day had taught them, that the silence was not empty, but active, shaping their choices by offering no guidance at all. By the end of the second day, waiting had ceased to feel temporary. It had become the safest response available, and safety, in an environment defined by uncertainty, was reason enough to continue doing exactly what the silence seemed to demand. As the third day unfolded without interruption, the men began to feel a shift that was difficult to name, yet impossible to ignore, because the silence that had once felt like a condition imposed upon them now felt like an active presence shaping every decision they made. What they had treated as absence gradually revealed itself as pressure, not through action, but through the constant demand to interpret what was not happening. The idea that the silence might be intentional settled slowly across the camp, not announced and not agreed upon openly, but shared through hesitation, restraint, and the careful way men mirrored one another's behavior. No one needed to say that this felt like a test, because everyone behaved as if it were one, adjusting movements and routines as though the wrong choice might finally provoke the response they had been waiting for. The men became acutely aware that acting normally could itself be suspicious. Following routine too closely might appear rehearsed, while changing behavior too suddenly might appear defiant, and this uncertainty narrowed the range of acceptable action until only the safest patterns remained. Remaining visible but inactive, compliant but unprovocative, present but unremarkable, felt like the only way to avoid drawing attention to oneself in a space where attention had become undefined. Each man watched the others for clues. A delayed movement, a glance held too long toward the gate, or a decision to step slightly outside the usual rhythm was noticed immediately, not with accusation, but with quiet alertness. The group did not need to enforce conformity directly, because the shared belief that the silence concealed consequence made self-correction instinctive. No one wanted to be the first to prove the silence false. In this way, the absence of authority became more restrictive than authority itself. Under guards and rules, behavior had been clear, even if harsh. One knew what was forbidden and what was allowed. Now, the boundaries were invisible, shifting, and impossible to confirm. The men were no longer responding to punishment, but to the fear of triggering something unseen, and that fear demanded constant restraint. As the day progressed, the sense of being tested intensified. The men began to interpret the lack of response as evidence that they were being observed closely, and that the correct behavior was not escape or defiance, but patience. Waiting ceased to feel like avoidance and began to feel like participation in the test itself, a way of demonstrating discipline without needing instruction. This belief changed how time was experienced. Hours no longer felt empty, but loaded, each moment carrying the possibility that the test would end and judgment would follow. The longer the silence persisted, the more convincing the trap became, because no one could imagine that such an absence of control would be allowed to continue without purpose. By the end of the third day, the men were no longer asking whether the silence meant freedom. They were asking how long it would last and what mistake would finally cause it to break. The camp remained outwardly calm, yet internally tense, sustained by the collective conviction that the safest course was to do nothing that might reveal intent. In this environment, freedom lost its meaning. Opportunity became indistinguishable from danger, and movement from mistake. The men did not need guards to restrain them, because the belief that they were being tested held them more effectively than any visible threat ever could. And so the silence continued, no longer experienced as absence, but as strategy, tightening its hold not through force, but through the shared understanding that the most dangerous trap is the one that never announces itself. As the belief that the silence concealed a trap settled deeper into the camp, the men began to adjust not only their individual behavior, but the way they moved together, responding less to their own uncertainty and more to the unspoken expectations forming between them. What had started as private restraint gradually became collective discipline, shaped by the shared desire to avoid being the one who disrupted whatever balance now seemed to protect them. No one announced new rules, yet rules emerged. Men began to arrive at familiar places at familiar times, not because they were instructed to, but because deviation felt increasingly risky. Standing too far apart drew attention, as did standing too close. Speaking too freely felt careless, while silence felt appropriate. The acceptable range of behavior narrowed quietly, guided not by authority, but by the careful observation of one another. This observation carried weight. A brief glance held a moment longer than necessary, a pause in conversation, or the sudden stillness of those nearby communicated disapproval more effectively than any command ever had. The men adjusted quickly, often before understanding what had prompted the correction, because maintaining alignment with the group felt essential to safety. The camp began to function smoothly again. From the outside, it might have appeared orderly, even calm, as if discipline had returned without force. Inside, the calm was maintained by constant awareness. Each man measured his actions not against rules, but against the collective rhythm, sensing when to move, when to stop, and when to remain unseen within the group. What made this system powerful was its subtlety. Because no one enforced it openly, it felt reasonable rather than oppressive. Participation seemed voluntary, even as it became increasingly difficult to imagine acting otherwise. The men did not feel controlled. They felt careful, responsible, and considerate, unaware that these qualities were now serving the same function as obedience once had. As days passed without disruption, the system reinforced itself. Each moment of stability confirmed that caution was working, that restraint was being rewarded, and that silence remained intact because they were behaving correctly. The absence of consequence became proof that the strategy was sound, strengthening commitment to the shared pattern. Individual impulses softened further. Men who once lingered near the gate stopped doing so. Curiosity faded, replaced by the comfort of predictability. Acting alone began to feel unnecessary, even reckless, when moving with the group offered reassurance. The camp no longer required guards to maintain order, because order had been absorbed into behavior itself. By the end of this phase, the men were no longer responding to the possibility of a trap, but to the system they had built to avoid it. Control existed everywhere and nowhere at once, diffused across glances, routines, and shared restraint, making it impossible to challenge without standing apart from everyone else. The silence did not need to threaten anymore. It had taught the men how to regulate themselves, how to preserve stability, and how to maintain obedience without instruction. What had once been fear of punishment had become fear of disruption, and fear of disruption was enough to keep the camp exactly as it was. As the quiet order they had built around themselves continued without disruption, the men began to experience a shift that was subtle yet decisive, because life inside the camp no longer felt tense or provisional, but settled into a rhythm that required little effort to maintain. Days unfolded predictably, shaped by routines that no longer needed reinforcement. And in this predictability, the men found a sense of relief that gradually outweighed the unease that freedom had once promised. The camp had become efficient again, not through force, but through familiarity. Men woke at roughly the same hours each morning, moved through the yard along paths worn smooth by repetition, and occupied spaces that felt established and safe. Conversations remained measured, actions restrained, and behavior aligned with what the group had come to expect. This alignment reduced uncertainty, and reducing uncertainty reduced strain. allowing the men to pass through each day without confronting difficult questions about what they should do next. Outside the camp, possibility remained abstract. The open gate and the silent boundaries no longer suggested opportunity, but risk, because leaving would require abandoning the structure that now organized their lives. Beyond the familiar rhythms lay a world without shared expectation, where each decision would need to be made alone and without reference. Inside the camp, life asked far less, offering clarity in exchange for limitation, and that exchange began to feel reasonable. Some men still approached the edges from time to time, standing near the boundary long enough to acknowledge its presence, yet never long enough to cross it. The hesitation was not dramatic. It felt practical. Leaving would disrupt the balance that had made the days manageable, while staying allowed the calm to continue uninterrupted. Stability became its own justification. The longer the system functioned, the harder it became to imagine dismantling it. Each day spent within the established order reinforced the next, until routine ceased to feel temporary and began to feel permanent. The camp no longer represented a condition to be escaped, but an environment that provided predictability in a world defined by uncertainty. What made this transformation particularly powerful was how little resistance it met. No one argued against leaving because leaving was never openly proposed. The idea faded quietly, replaced by the immediate comfort of knowing what was expected and how to meet those expectations. The men did not experience themselves as choosing confinement. They experienced themselves as choosing ease. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the men were no longer restrained by fear of punishment or belief in a hidden trap. They were restrained by the comfort of a system that removed the burden of decision-making. Obedience had become voluntary. Routine had become refuge, and the camp had transformed into a place where life felt manageable precisely because it demanded so little. Staying required no courage. Leaving would require more than any of them were ready to give. And so the silence held, not as a threat, but as a container, preserving an order that no longer needed to be enforced, sustained by the shared understanding that in a world without clear guidance, safety was found not in freedom, but in familiarity. In the end, the camp did not remain intact because of fences, guards, or hidden threats waiting to be revealed, but because the men inside it had adapted so completely to uncertainty that familiarity felt safer than possibility. What had begun as caution slowly became habit, and habit settled into something that no longer felt temporary, but necessary. There was no single moment when the decision to stay was made, no clear refusal of freedom that could be identified or questioned. Instead, there were only delays that repeated themselves quietly, moments of hesitation that accumulated until they felt natural, and routines that offered relief from the responsibility of choosing without guidance. The silence did not need to command obedience, because it had already taught the men how to regulate themselves. It rewarded restraint, preserved stability, and removed the risk that came with acting alone. In a place where the absence of authority demanded constant judgment, surrendering to routine felt like intelligence rather than fear. The guards never returned, and nothing dramatic followed their disappearance, because nothing needed to. Control had survived without them, carried forward through expectation, familiarity, and the quiet agreement to maintain what felt manageable. And so the camp continued, not as a prison enforced by force, but as a space shaped by habit, leaving behind a quiet reminder that the most powerful restraints are not imposed suddenly, but built slowly until they no longer feel like restraints at all. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.